Well, here we are. Wicked Part 1 finally came out, and I think it went better than expected.
She came down in a bubble, dog. I'm not fighting with you.
For me personally, who's a giant fan of live theater and movies, sometimes when they come together, it's not the perfect translation. But more importantly, there's one thing in Wicked that's going to have a big impact on the future of entertainment. But before we get into any of that, let's talk about the good and the bad of Wicked Part 1. First and foremost, if you put Michelle Yeoh and Jeff Goldblum in a movie together, I'm gonna watch it. So you already had me there. Not to mention the director, John Chu, just did another one of my favorite adaptations, In the Heights. But that doesn't mean the direction is flawless in every scene. There's some moments that feel clunky or can get boring with the blocking. However, the only reason they stick out is because there's amazing moments with the choreography, or the live singing, or the dynamic colors that appear for one song and then kind of disappear. Yeah, that's a big problem too. People did not like the color grading for this one, and I have to agree. I think in Oz, which is supposed to be so colorful, it did really kind of have a toned down look for the overall feeling, which isn't a terrible thing because it depends on the story you're trying to tell, but it showed in other scenes when he had dynamic and interesting lighting that it was possible. So for me personally, I don't really understand those decisions. When you look at a movie like La La Land, which has dynamic and amazing cinematics, literally you can go through every frame of that movie, but for performances, had me worried. All right, with all the controversy coming out with Cynthia with a poster and Ariana and her weird relationship with SpongeBob, and don't even get me started on their press tour. But regardless of all my fears towards this, they honestly all went out the window as soon as that first number started. It went hard. Now, could I understand a single word that Glinda was whistle-toning? No, I honestly really wanted captions for this movie. I'm not gonna lie. The sound mixing is nowhere as bad as Tenet, besides when they're going from talking to song, because I don't think they have that figured out yet.
It's me.
However, to me, the most important thing was seeing that they put passion and love into this movie. You can see that in the first 5 minutes. The costumes alone, I think she'll win an Oscar, but the production, having so many practical effects that it made the VFX look out of place, that's an amazing feat to accomplish in a movie that came out in 2024. There's also a lot of Easter eggs and nods to the fans. I think there's so much opportunity to go above and beyond when adapting a stage production to a feature film, because originally you just have one stage, and audience really uses their imagination and the few sets you have that you can change out to tell the story. But in this film in particular, they really leaned into having these practical sets and these environments that felt real and lived in, that made it a lot more worthwhile for an adaptation to take place. However, after constantly reminding myself that this movie doesn't take place in Narnia, let's finally get into the larger impact of Wicked Part 1.
They not like us. They not like us. They not like us.
Well, I think it's just that, a Part 1. The surprise came to everyone pre-release that they were deciding to take this 2-hour and 45-minute theater production and make it into 2 feature-length productions. The first one, which already exceeds the entire time of the original. And if you're familiar with the whole story of Wicked, in my opinion, I think Act 1 is way bounds above Act 2, and that's kind of where it loses me a little bit, because all the really good songs are in Act 1 and all the big moments that are really important to me. The director justified this, saying there was a lot of talks back and forth between if they wanted to have 1 or 2 movies, and originally the studio didn't really know what they wanted, so they were kind of saying, oh, 2, oh, never mind 1. And then he decided that, if you're going to have 1 movie, you can't really cut that down in an appropriate way without doing some real damage to it, which I can agree with. It's a massive story, and I think they added a lot of time for you to sit with the scenes and not have to rush through everything, because even if it was a 3-hour movie or a 3.5-hour movie, I honestly don't think people would have been interested past Defying Gravity, because that's a curtain dropping performance. So after that, you kind of check out mentally. I can see how it might all go downhill from there. But how did this happen? And is the critique valid that Part 1 and Part 2 movies are just a cash grab and easy money for studios? Or is it a necessary evil that we all have to endure? Starting in the 2010s, Harry Potter Deathly Hallows was the first adaptation to split the source material into 2 final movies. And before long, this was followed closely by Twilight and the Hunger Games series, both having a Part 2 for their final movie. However, with all of these adaptations, there's something that stuck out to me. Whether it was Part 1 or Part 2, one of them suffered greatly for having the story split down the middle. Like in Deathly Hallows, where the first part is basically a glorified camping trip, and at the end of the first movie, there's still 6 Horcruxes to find and a war to fight, so you kind of get more excited for part 2 because that's where all the action and interesting things happen and the story actually moves forward. And the same thing happened with Mockingjay Part 1. They added so much fluff, and beside a few good moments and the best cameo of all time, it left a lot to be desired. And at that point just seemed like they really just wanted to have 2 movies to make more money for this great series that was ending. Not to mention this idea has really hurt movies before, like the Divergent series, which never even got to make their final part 2. The interest dropped off so much and therefore the money, and the studios did not like that, so they canceled part 2 from ever even coming out. And currently we're seeing a similar thing happen to the Spider-Verse movies, where originally Across the Spider-Verse was split into 2 movies because the story was too big for them to tell in one, but part 2 evidently hasn't come out in the past 2 years. The most interesting thing to me is a lot of these adaptations don't have enough source material to build off of. Like I mentioned before, Harry Potter Deathly Hallows was split into 2 movies. However, it wasn't even the longest Harry Potter book. And since the Harry Potter series, since the beginning, wasn't shy about cutting things and changing adaptation, it was strange they had so much time for this smaller book and still didn't execute it perfectly. Even crazier than that is Mockingjay, which is half the size of Deathly Hallows. So where are they getting this idea they need 2 movies? They don't. It's for money. But even in the current climate, there were great adaptations from books that still hold up today, like Lord of the Rings. Now, you can't tell me that if Return of the King was filmed in 2024, it would not have a 2-part finale. I promise you it would be part 1 and part 2. But Peter Jackson, as amazing as he is, decided that this story, however big, could be condensed in a trilogy of its own making. The Hobbit? No. I don't know why that's 3 movies. That should not be 3 movies. I'm so sorry if you love Hobbit more than Lord of the Rings, which is already out of pocket. But The Hobbit should have been 2 movies max. 2 max. I really think that was probably too long of a series. I'm sorry, Peter Jackson. I can't give you that one.
You're winging it. You've got nothing to go on. No storyboards, no previs. You've got these massively complicated scenes and you're just making it up.
And yes, there are extended editions of these movies, which make the runtime longer, allowing them time to tell the full story, which I think is a great idea. Instead of having 2 parts, have an extended version for superfans, you know, people who really love the series and want to watch more of it. But that brings me to this particular phenomenon. Wicked Part 2 is kind of necessary.
What did he say?
Before we get into it, let's put ourselves in 2 leagues, in defense and against Wicked Part 1. Already a week in, this is the highest grossing musical adaptation movie ever made. They broke the record for opening day box office numbers for musical adaptations. I had to go see it at 8:30 on a Sunday morning, and my theater was still full. However, despite all this, it all happened after the decision to make it into 2 parts, so why did they put us in the longest intermission of all time? Well, in defense of the movie, part 1 showed us that the pacing was really well thought out. Now, that does make me a little worried for part 2 because they don't have as much story to tell, in my opinion. But they are going to add things from the book, which they already noted that they're going to change some things in the story. And it was already confirmed that the original composer wrote more original songs for part 2. So overall, I do respect the time and effort put into this movie, getting painted green every day, you know, breaking Mach 5 speed on your broom in the last second, and almost blowing out the theater speakers. And them songs do be catchy, but if you're someone who sang them in the theater during the show, straight to jail. Straight to jail. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. You're about to catch a yellow brick in the back of the head.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.
But most importantly, splitting the movie allowed moments to breathe. Characters to have better and more intimate interactions, have these prolonged moments together that you would not get if the movie was not split into 2 parts. And as I already mentioned, Defying Gravity is the best spot to end part 1. You're not going to get any better than that. You're going to have to rush towards a conclusion in Act 2, and you missed a high point, which was Defying Gravity, which also makes me concerned about part 2, because what is that high point going to be if they already have the majority of the most popular songs in the first film? Now, that all being said, does this mean that every movie needs 2 parts? No. God, please no. It's for money. Okay, seriously, no, that is a valid argument, but in this case, I think the creative decision to do that was a little more than the financial, because they already made enough money back for the whole movie, I'm sure. They made so much money already, and now that they know that, they're probably going to make double the amount with a part 2, which scares me for the future of filmmaking, because every adaptation or every longer story that a filmmaker wants to tell they're going to be allowed to do part 2s now because they see the success from this series. I've also seen some people upset about the gap in the movies, a whole year. I mean, that's pretty common when you have these part 1 and part 2 movies. Like every other one had about almost a year in between them. So this is common practice. The director did come out and say they filmed part 1 and part 2 simultaneously. So it should already be done. And they had reshoots back in like 22, I believe, or 23 during the strikes, which is another problem I have. If you have a strike, you can't film anything more. You can't put the movie out. But that could also lead to problems in the future. Like I mentioned with Across the Spider-Verse, the reason they really haven't done more on part 2 to have the next movie come out in the past 2 years is because of the strikes. Right in production, they were halted, and that lost a lot of money, so lost a lot of faith, and people lost interest, which could happen with this movie. Now, I think, like I said, he filmed them at the same time, so it should be done, but if they have to go back for reshoots, and there happens to be another strike, or anything happens for any movie in the future who's trying to replicate this, where they lose a lot of money, and then the audience loses faith in them, and then you end up with Allegiant and Spider-Verse 2. Another problem I have is the runtime of part 2. They're going to have to add a lot. Like I mentioned, they're adding new songs, but how much more fluff and, extra time and go in depth of the story are they going to have to do to make it worth it? Because they're obviously going to want to make at least a 2-hour run, if not 2.5 hours. So that's 5 hours of Wicked based off of a 2-hour and 45-minute play.
What?
I think they will have a story to tell with so much left in the musical and the book, but will it be able to stand on its own? The important thing is that these movies can stand as their own film despite having a part 2 or a part 3. And more interestingly, will this fanfare continue all the way into next year? Will it start next year during the release date? Or will people even care as much as they do now? And while I don't see any reason the production would pull out or any delays would happen for this movie, there are some controversies that happened during the release of this first movie that could halt or push back the release. Let's just say there's going to have to be some more PR training before the next movie. But most importantly, I want to know what you guys think. Is it worth having 2 parts? Was part 1 everything you dreamed it would be? What are your thoughts for part 2? Is it going to be better, as good, or the worst thing in the world? Green. But despite all that, you can't deny that Wicked Part 1 was a phenomenally well-crafted, well-thought-out, and well-done movie. Put your thoughts down below, subscribe right now if you haven't already, and as always, thanks for watching.